Thank you very much. Let me try and share my screen. Thank you very much. Konnichiwa. I'm very happy to be here with you. Thank you to RIETI and to Meti for organizing this seminar, which indeed revolves around a book that was recently published, let's say a few months ago, by Harvard University Press. And there are two pieces of information I wanted to share with you about this book, which is the first is that it is a trade book. Now, in the language of publishers, what a trade book is a book that is written for a wide public. And so it is a book that I've written for people that don't necessarily have technical knowledge or deep knowledge of the economics of climate change. It is a book written for anyone who has an interest in these topics. And everything that is more technical, references to papers, for those of you that are interested, is instead pushed into the endnotes. So it's a sort of a book that exists in two layers, depending on the degree, on the amount of time you want to dedicate to it. And the final information is that it's a book that is available worldwide. I am told it's also available in Japan, although only in English for the time being, for now. Now, when I've given these presentations over the past month and a half, I've realized that to give a sense of what the book is about, it helps to reflect a little bit on the genesis of this book, on how I started thinking about the topics of the book or writing this book. And this book is very much let's say, a product of the COVID-19 pandemic. And the initial thought about it was developed during the lockdown, the first lockdown of the COVID-19 pandemic. You might recall there was a new disease. We knew little about it. It was deadly. There was no treatment. There was no vaccine. So governments decided to put in place stay-at-home orders, lockdown measures. So we were all at home in our apartments, and everything was going bad, let's say, in the sense that the public health situation was bad. The economy was bad because consumption was dropping dramatically. So the economy, let's say, broadly speaking, was bad. And for those that were looking for at least one piece of good information or something positive, perhaps one positive element that people saw was this idea that, environmental indicators were seen to be improving. So as a result of this COVID lockdown measures, quality of the air started to improve. CO2 emissions started to drop. Quality of water improved. At some point, even some of these pictures were spread on social media showing dolphins in Venice, in the canals of Venice. And of course, these pictures were later proved to be false, fabricated. So there were no dolphins in Venice's canals. But this overall narrative sort of stuck with me, because I started thinking, okay, but what is the relationship between, let's say, the economy, broadly defined, and nature, broadly defined? And so could it be that because we know that in order to avoid catastrophic climate change, we need to bring down these CO2 emissions, because we know that we need to, let's say, reconcile ourselves, our societies with nature, or reduce our pressure on nature? Could it be that even once COVID is long gone, even once lockdown measures are no longer in place, could it be that as part of the toolbox, in order to reduce CO2 emissions, could it be that we need to curtail the economy, to reduce the size of the economy? And that's a bit how the reflection on this book started. And it sort of started as a reflection, as I was saying, on the relationship between economic growth, which you see in the bottom left corner, and nature, broadly defined. And as soon as you start reflecting on these two things, you have to bring in an extra layer, which is the system, the way our economic system is organized, which is capitalism. And the result is this triangle that you see in this slide. And all the book is about is basically a reflection on the connections between the three sides of this triangle. And so it is a reflection on, aside from identifying what economic growth is, what capitalism is, what we mean with nature and so on, it is a reflection on the connections. And so, for example, what is the connection between economic growth and capitalism? Could it be that capitalism requires growth? Or what is the relationship between growth and nature, as I was saying? So could it be that in order to have growth, the only way is to destroy the planet or to continue burning fossil fuels? What is the relationship between capitalism and nature? Can we have green capitalism, as many would argue, or are the two some sort of impossible to reconcile forces? And this is what the book is all about. So if there is only one slide that you remember out of this presentation, it would be this one, because it contains everything that the book talks about. Given I have more time, I will not stop at that slide, but we will continue, and I'll go a bit deeper into the reflection. Now, when I've given this presentation in the past in places like the OECD, in places like the Peterson Institute, so in fora of economists, typically already at this point, people are sort of confused, because they say, economists are sort of confused because they say, we know that economic growth matters, and we know that economic growth is, we cannot do away with economic growth, and therefore, why did you even bother to write a book about this? So why did you waste 2 years of your life, of your time, to write this book about something that is self-evident? And what I try to argue in this slide and in the book itself is that for a growing share of the population, particularly in rich, advanced economies, at least in Europe and the United States, you can tell me if this is the case also in Japan. But there is a growing share of people who are actually not so convinced anymore that economic growth is a useful target. And I argue that this is particularly the case for one generation, so millennials, my generation and below, so Generation Z, let's say. And millennials and Generation Z are growing disenchanted with economic growth for a variety of reasons. The first, I would argue, is that, especially for millennials, for which we already have the data, we haven't seen that much economic growth per se. And that is what this chart on the left tries to show. This is a chart that shows the cumulative growth that people in different generations in the United States have experienced in the first 15 years of their working life. And what this shows is that effectively millennials have seen the least economic growth of any generation in US history. Going beyond raw data, if I look at my experience, I graduated from university at the cusp of the great financial crisis. And then because I'm European, in Europe, we had the Eurozone crisis, then we had secular stagnation, then we had the COVID recession, now we have an energy crisis caused by Russia's invasion of Ukraine, and so we're likely to see a further stagnation or recession, and so we haven't seen that much economic growth. The second point is that when we have seen some of this economic growth, this has gone hand in hand with increasing inequalities. And this is what the chart on the top right tries to show. It is the income accruing to the top 1% in the United States as compared to Japan. And so for some countries, and the United States is a particular example, also as discussed in pioneering work by economist Thomas Piketty in his book Capital in the 21st Century, there is a growing share of income, of national income, that accrues to the top 1%. And so you can see that the critique could be, we haven't seen much economic growth. On top of that, when we have seen it, much of it, or a disproportionate share of it, has been captured by those that are already wealthy, or those that are already rich, be it the top 1%, the top 0.1%, the largest corporations, you name it. And on top of that, there is a growing environmental awareness among young people. And it is a fact that historically, if you look at the longer term, let's say over the last 200 years, economic growth and CO2 emissions have proceeded broadly hand in hand. And so all of this combined gives us a sense of why actually many people, particularly those that are not economists, let's say, are growing not so convinced that economic growth is a positive target on its own. Now, the first part of the book tries to reflect on this relationship between economic growth and capitalism. And that's what so as I was saying, that the first part of the book comes rapidly to the conclusion that given current preferences, and I underline this because we're going to touch upon this in a second, but given current preferences, capitalism and economic growth are sort of live in symbiosis. And what I try to say is that there are some features of capitalism that constantly foster economic growth. These can be the fact that it's a system organized around profit maximization. It is a system organized around competition, that firms in competition try to maximize the share of consumers they reach, and so on. So there are certain features of capitalism that generate, let's say, this constant economic growth, or desire for economic growth. And the implication I try to reach is not necessarily that this is a good or a bad thing, at least for the beginning of the book, but I try to caution upfront that we often hear, my impression is that we often hear calls to abandon economic growth as part of a long list of things we would need, typically within an environmental discussion. And so there are people, especially among scientists, is my impression, that list a number of things that we would need, let's say, more solar panels, more onshore wind, offshore wind, more circular economy. And by the way, we also need to get rid of this obsession with economic growth. And what I say there is, you're perfectly allowed to say that we have to abandon economic growth, but careful, because what you're saying there is that because the two, capitalism and growth, are intertwined, if you get rid of one, you're saying that we have to get rid of the other. And so if you're saying that, you need to be ready to present also a blueprint of how you would organize society in an alternative way. You cannot just add it as the extra element on a long list of things that we would need. Now, when I was writing this book and when I was making this point, I realized that there is actually non-mainstream or heterodox literature that realizes the fact that capitalism and growth are intertwined. And this falls under the umbrella of a literature called, it depends, it can be called degrowth literature, it can be called eco-socialism. Some of its advocates call for a steady state economy. There was an article a few days ago on the New York Times about Herman Daly, who is an economist, a heterodox economist who professes the steady state economy. And what all these people say in a nutshell is that indeed we have to get rid of economic growth. They realize that there is a nexus with capitalism, so they say we have to get rid of capitalism as well, because we have to focus on nature. And the result of this is that, yes, we might have some scarcity, but that type of literature would say, you know, this should be voluntary scarcity. So we should embrace, let's say, a concept of minimalism, but at the level of society as a whole. And so we would have less, but we would be happy with less, and we would share the lesser resources or things that we have better among ourselves. And so we would reconcile, we would be reconciled with nature and among ourselves in a way. Now, my book, Growth for Good, reaches a different conclusion. On the first point, what I try to argue, and there I take very much also a historical approach, and this is something that if you choose to read the book, you will see throughout. But one of the reasons why I take this historical approach is to show, obviously, you know, throughout the rapid growth is a recent phenomenon that started around the Industrial Revolution in Europe first, and then spreading to other parts of the world. And so we have experience with a period when there was limited or no economic growth. And when that is the case, it is not so much that we share the limited resources that we have, but rather when you are in a steady state environment, this exacerbates conflict, both within society, within groups in society, and between societies or between countries. And so I go sort of against this utopian view that, you know, we will just come together and share what is left. But actually, what is likely is a much more dystopian scenario in which we fight over what is left, which is obviously something that we would want to avoid. And the reason for this is that, again, the heterodox thinking on this sort of sees this desire for more, or this preference for more, as, you know, an evil imposition of capitalism on people who would otherwise be indifferent. And so that it is all the fault of this evil system that is forcing us to consume more or want more when actually we would be happy with less. And I try to bring a lot of examples. I'm not going to go into the details now, but you'll find them in the book to say, look, this is not, maybe there are some features of modern capitalism, like advertisement, like planned obsolescence, things like this, that at the margin foster a bit of a culture of consumption. But overall, it hinges on desires that are deeper than that. And when I take a really, really long-term historical perspective on humankind, in a way, what I try to say is that this desire for more is actually what has led us as humans to use our shared intelligence, our shared know-how, our technology, our tools to shape the environment in our favor and to get more of what we wanted. So not to settle with what we just found on planet Earth, but rather to try and twist and turn things so that we would have more of things that we wanted or that we cared about. And so in a way, the self-determination or the desire for self-determination as a species, which is what has propelled us to the top of the food chain on this planet, is deeply intertwined with this desire for more, which as a conclusion is unlikely to just go away. A point I try to make is that it is something that I can do quantitatively with you also here by borrowing from an article from a back of the envelope calculation that comes from an article on the Financial Times of a few years ago by Martin Wolf. And what he says is, you know, let's do a thought experiment. So let's say that we keep global GDP constant between now and mid-century, between now and 2050. So let's assume we achieve that and we are in a steady state economy at planetary level. If we were to just do that, and the pace of the rollout of the green transition were to continue at the rate at which it has been happening up until now, by 2050, emissions will be down by roughly 40%, which is, however, very far from net zero, which is what climate scientists tell us that we need to achieve in order to avoid the worst effects of catastrophic climate change. And what this implies is that a steady state economy on its own cannot be a solution, but rather it will require two things. Either it requires a very big acceleration in technology and in the rollout of green technologies, or it would require a shrinking of income levels. It's not sufficient to just say, you know, we settle with what we have, but rather we would need to shrink incomes. And in particular, when you look at this, let's say at the heterodox literature that argues in this direction on the steady state or a degrowth type of literature, they obviously focus on rich countries, because what they say is rich countries need to shrink in order to open up space so that very poor countries can continue growing, because they obviously need to provide for the extreme poverty, or to reduce the extreme poverty of their populations. And so when you focus on only on rich countries, the size of the reduction is huge. So we're talking about something like 60% reduction in income levels, which, you know, it doesn't mean you are changing your smartphone once every 4 years rather than once every 2 years. We are talking about something that is massive, and something that is very unlikely to ever be democratically, but even beyond that, to be decided as one society upon itself in the service of a greater good. And so what I argue is that pursuing the technological acceleration channel is actually the only realistic and credible way to do this. While I was doing this reflection, there was obviously, I mentioned to you before, there was a reflection on economic growth and nature. And what I try to say there is that there is nothing from a theoretical perspective, or when reflecting on what economic growth is, which is about fulfilling needs and wants by using know-how or technology. There is nothing in this definition that says that the only way to achieve economic growth is by burning fossil fuels, or by extracting raw materials, or by destroying nature, and so on. This might be the current model, the current system, but it doesn't have to be that way. But the implication then is that a different type of model, or a different type of capitalism, or a reshaped capitalism, as I call it in the subtitle of my book, or perhaps a new capitalism, as it is being dubbed in Japan recently, would be needed. The overarching message of the book is that, in a way, what I was mentioning to you before, which is, in order to avoid a climate catastrophe, or doing that, will go through a deep acceleration in the development and the deployment of green technologies. And what I try to say there is that capitalism has perhaps many ills, many negative sides to it, but if there is one thing that the system is good at, is that it is an efficient machinery at developing and deploying technology, know-how, innovation throughout society in general. And however, this is not to mean that, you know, the system is gonna solve all our problems, that capitalism will solve climate change on its own, and therefore that we can sit back, relax, and wait for capitalism to save us all. This is not what I'm saying, but rather we will need to take certain measures in order to reorient capitalism, in order to enroll it in our fight against climate change. So in order to use the strength of the system in the service of our goal of decarbonizing our economies, and avoiding a climate catastrophe. Now, I'm obviously giving this talk organized by a ministry of the economy, by a think tank, and it's the same when I give this talk in Brussels, for example, where I work, where I live, which is obviously a very policy-driven city, and there's a lot of focus on what governments can do. And there is a lot that governments can do. There's the usual carbon pricing, there's regulation, there's a lot of things that can be done. But it doesn't stop there. And what I try to say and argue in the book is that we are talking about something that is bigger than this, and that is probably closer to a whole of nation approach, because it will require, given the size of this effort and given the speed at which this effort has to happen, it requires everybody to be on board. It requires pioneering businesses, business leaders to be on board. And crucially, it requires citizens to be on board who are also consumers. And so in this double role, it is of crucial importance that consumers are on board, not least because what the degree to which consumers or citizens rather are on board with the green transition determines how much governments can do. So if consumers or citizens are not interested or don't see the importance of the green transition, they will not allow governments to take the measures that are needed in order to avoid a climate catastrophe. While writing this book, I realized that, let's say, the social dimension and the green dimension are actually very deeply intertwined. And what I argue, and we will talk about this more in a second, but what I argue is that the degree of the transformation that we are envisioning is something that is close to an industrial revolution or to a new industrial revolution. And we know from past industrial revolutions that when these technological transformations happen, they obviously completely modify the structure of the economy, but in so doing, some areas are at risk of being left behind. Some regions are at risk of being left behind. Some people, some professions, some cultural values are at risk of being shattered. And this can be a reality or it can be a perception. But whether it is perception or reality, so whether it is people that feel they are being left behind or feel that they are not part of this, it is a fact. And there is a great book that I suggest to all of you, which is this book by Professor Calestus Juma, that looks at the history of innovation throughout civilization, throughout history. It looks at the printing press and why the printing press was not rapidly taken up in the Ottoman Empire. So we're really talking long term, which is a bit my focus in research. And when he does that, he realizes that, or he concludes that societies that are polarized, societies that leave large chunks of people behind, are those that are least likely to be able to engage in these technological transformations. And so what I try to argue is that the green transformation and social policy, or the social dimensions, are actually very closely intertwined, and that one rests on the other, and that the degree to which we're going to be able to achieve the green transition relies on the degree to which we can keep everybody or society cohesive and everybody on board, and make sure that certain parts of society are not left behind. And again, I'm no expert. I'm not an expert of Japanese economic policy, but I was catching up on my readings on this, let's say, framing of a new capitalism that Prime Minister Kishida was mentioning over the past few months, and there seems to be a lot of this reflection in there. There is much more in the book. Of course, I was only given 40 minutes, so I need to skip certain parts, but just to give you a sense of what you will find if you choose to read it, there is a discussion on economic growth and how it relates to well-being, how it relates to liberal democracy. So really a bit more of a reflection on why economic growth matters, why we care about it, and so on. The book, the way I framed it to you, it sounds very abstract, very theoretical, but actually it's a book that has an abstract part, has a historical part, but it is also very practical. And this practicality can be seen not only in the fact that there is a detailed list of the things that are needed in order to achieve a green transition, but also because, for example, there is a case study chapter that takes Italy as an example of a steady state economy, so an economy that hasn't really seen economic growth for the past 30 years. And it shows the negative dynamics that are unleashed when an economy enters a steady state. There's also a comparison there with Japan, which is taken instead as a more positive example because it's an economy that has retained a high degree of productivity growth. There is a section on international cooperation, which is evidently an important topic when we talk about climate policy and climate change, given it is a global problem. But there I try to reflect on what is realistic what can we realistically expect from climate cooperation. And finally, there's a section on what is called green macro. And so the idea there is, if we were to implement all of these policies, if we were to implement let's say, green deals, which take different names in different countries, whether it is Build Back Better in the US, whether it is the European Green Deal, it's sort of beyond the point. But if we were to do all these things that are needed, what would happen to economic growth? And that's a bit what I wanted to zoom on before closing this presentation in the last 10 minutes or so. Now, according to one narrative, my perception is that many people present the green transition as costs and focus on costs, and they present it as an expensive thing that we need to do. But it's sort of something that is not an investment opportunity because, you know, we are in the best of cases, we're achieving the same things we already have. At the macro perspective, think, you know, in the best scenario, we're just preserving the climate that we already have. We're not getting a better one. And if you think at the sectorial level, you know, for example, you're changing your internal combustion engine car for an electric vehicle. The electric vehicle for now is more expensive than the internal combustion engine one, but they serve the same purpose. They still drive you around or allow you to go around. So at the end, you have higher costs and limited rewards, or the same type of service you already had. So it's not an investment opportunity according to this narrative, and it creates stranded assets because companies have invested all of these resources in fossil fuel infrastructure, and they sort of have to give that. When we insert the green transition in macro models, we also find muted impact on GDP, so very limited impact on GDP. I would argue against this reading. So in my impression, there are several problems with this reading. The first is a problem of baseline, of defining the baseline. And my impression is that all of these models, or most of these models, compare the green policy against a business as usual scenario, or a baseline that is you know, a protracted trend of what we have already seen. So you take GDP over the past 50 years, you extend the line, that is the business as usual scenario, and we see what happens with when you implement these green policies. And obviously we know that this business as usual scenario doesn't exist. It's actually the only scenario that does not exist. Ahead of us, there is either a scenario in which we manage to get the green transition going, or a scenario where we don't, and there's catastrophic climate change. And when you take catastrophic climate change as the baseline, as was done recently in a chapter of the World Economic Outlook by the International Monetary Fund, if you take the scenario, let's say the baseline scenario being climate change and catastrophic outcomes, any green policy you manage to achieve is a deviation from a very negative scenario, and therefore it has positive gains, and it is an investment opportunity, which reflects something that I argue, but I'm not alone, which is that there is a poor integration between economic and climate models. The other point I would like to make, and this can be made quickly, is sort of a Lucas critique for those other economists in the room. And what a Lucas critique is say, look, we use models of the economy that have been built around the current economy, but we're trying to model a complete restructuring of the economy itself. And so a model of the current economy cannot give us a good sense of what is going to happen in the future. But more broadly, I've argued before, and I argue again, that this is closer, it's going to be closer to an industrial revolution that is going to transform everything in the system. It's going to transform production, consumption, agriculture, housing, transport, you name it. And when that happens, it's going to recast comparative advantages between countries and between firms. And some countries will emerge as losers and some will emerge as winners. And those that are losers are those that remain stuck in technologies that will be rapidly perceived as old, as lower quality. And here, in order to try and persuade you that I'm not crazy and that this is closer to an industrial revolution and that it's closer to what has happened in the past, I borrow from the great work of economic historian Roger Fouquet, who is at the London School of Economics, and he looks at energy transitions of the past. And we have this mindset or this idea that, you know, in the past energy transitions were much cheaper and they entailed immediate productivity improvements, but that's not the case. Actually, most, and this is a list, a non-comprehensive list, most of the energy transitions of the past had exactly the characteristics of the current one, which is they were initially more expensive, but they displayed some positive features. Perhaps they were cleaner, perhaps they were more flexible, perhaps they were easier to use, whatever. And because of these features, richer households, richer governments, and so on, would adopt these technologies. As they were doing that, these new technologies would walk down cost curves, they would become cheaper, and at some point they were so much cheaper that everybody else in society would get on board, which I would argue is exactly what we're going to see with the green transition. Still, there's people who are not convinced by my type of argument because they say, you know, but the past industrial revolutions entailed huge productivity improvements, and we're not seeing productivity improvements in green technologies right now. And what I argue again is that if you look carefully at the history of past industrial revolutions, actually early on, they did not display all these productivity improvements. And the reason for that is that a new technology, if it was, you know, the steam engine and mechanized the cotton spinning for the first industrial revolution, whether it is electricity, a switch from steam engine to electricity for the second industrial revolution, early on, firms don't know how to use these things. They had to set up workshops, they had to reorganize workshops, and only once they managed to do that do we observe these productivity improvements. And therefore, the question there is whether the green transformation, the green transition has scope for secondary innovation. And I would argue that it is indeed the case, and that too often the narratives that I was mentioning earlier are those that, you know, portray this energy transition as if we are just going to switch from the internal combustion engine car to the electric car, and that's the end of the story. But obviously, it's not going to be the end of the story, and rather innovation will continue. And there are reasons to believe that innovation will continue and will accelerate. And one of the reasons I take from a report written by Nicholas Stern and Joseph Stiglitz, and what they say there is, you know, we've been experimenting with fossil fuel technologies for, you know, over 200 years roughly, and so we had probably reached some diminishing returns. And instead, now that we are entering new technological spheres, we are likely to see a potential acceleration in productivity growth. And this is not least, when focusing on energy specifically, this is not least a possibility because, again, green energy sources might be more expensive now, but there's nothing that says they must be more expensive forever. And actually, it is the International Energy Agency that tells us that renewable energies could rapidly become the cheapest energy source in history, and that would obviously boost productivity levels across the economy. The implications, and this is my final slide, are threefold. The implication of all of this is, first, it makes self-interested commercial sense for countries, for companies to embrace this green transition, to try and be at the forefront of this green transition, because if you assume that this is the technology of the future, you want to be the one that is defining standards, that is steering the very course of this technological transformation. And so there are benefits to try and be at the forefront of this green transition, benefits that are, I repeat, self-interested. So even if you forget about what we owe to our children, our grandchildren, the moral dimension of it, it makes self-interested sense to try and be at the forefront of this transition. The second point is focuses a bit on governments. And because I told you that, you know, comparative advantages will be recast, because I've told you that there will be winners and losers, as we have seen in the past, it is very unlikely, it is very hard to expect governments to just sit back, take a hands-off approach and wait and see on which side of the fence their country ends up, or in terms of being on the winner side or being on the loser side. And rather what is likely is that countries are going to try and use their tools, their policy tools, to make sure that their companies emerge as winners. This, again, I underline, it's something we have seen already in the past. Already in the first industrial revolution, there is this myth that the first industrial revolution was just done by the business sector, but actually governments were taking active steps, including in England, in order to push their industries, both at home and abroad. And so what this will imply is that, for example, we will see more and more of this push for an active industrial policy. We're already seeing this in the discourse, and this will lay the seed, I would argue, for also more defensive industrial policy. And we can talk about this more if you want in the Q&A. There's going to be a more active, I would argue, I suspect, a more active use of trade clauses. Again, trade clauses in trade treaties, carbon border tax, carbon border adjustment mechanisms, and so on. And then finally, one point on emerging markets. When I've given you a talk that is very focused on rich countries, a talk that is very focused on, let's say, on Europe, on the US, on Japan, on Korea, South Korea. But obviously the world is much bigger than that. And when I give this talk to friends or policymakers in emerging markets, they say, you know, but we have to focus on development, and this green transition is something that rich countries can do, but we don't have, we have to focus first on growth and development, and then maybe later we will do the green transition. And what I argue is that this is a fallacy. This is a wrong trade-off, or a false trade-off. And what it builds on is a false understanding or false belief that there is a model that is based on development, and a development that is based on fossil fuels, on polluting technologies. And what I would argue is that by doing so, you're actually at risk of locking in yourself into technologies that are rapidly going to be perceived as old, as worst quality, as lower quality, and probably that are going to be also more expensive soon, because I told you that green technologies will rapidly become also the cheaper option. And so you're locking yourself into something that is old, that is not going to guarantee you growth, also because of the carbon border tax processes and so on that will be put in place eventually. And so this is a false trade-off, and it makes more sense also for emerging markets to try and catch the train of the green transition. My 40 minutes are up, and I thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Dr. TERZI. Maybe 40 minutes is too short for your very insightful thinking. And I'm not quite sure I understood your holy trinity among the capitalism, growth, and the nature. But my main takeaway from your excellent presentation is we are still at the very early inception stage of the great transformation. As you mentioned that we are talking about transition on the scale of industrial revolution. So we are maybe at the very early stage of that great transition. We need to switch green technology, restructure of the whole economy, and whole of nation approach, as you said, are needed involving government, business, and engaged citizens. We also listened your view on the implication for industrial policy. That would be very interesting. Thank you very much for very interesting and insightful presentation.